Okay, I would say that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was, I think there's plenty of evidence for the Exodus. I think it's good evidence. So Amun-her-kepešef died as an adult. His firstborn son died as a child. We do know that there was one of the viziers of Egypt died around the same time in the 25th regnal year. Oh boy.
Welcome to another episode of NT Podcast. I am your host, Nemanja Jurišić, and today we have a truly special guest with us. Joining us is Dr. David Falk, an esteemed Egyptologist and biblical scholar. Dr. Falk, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
This is our third interview so far. You are our still best guest ever, and it is a real
Still
pleasure.
best guest ever, huh?
Yeah, I really enjoy, and audience also, I believe. And in case someone maybe don't know, Dr. Falk holds 4 degrees. One of them is PhD in Egyptology at the University of 5. Oh, sorry, I'm outdated. Yeah, nice. He has authored the book Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context, an illustrated journey, and is currently working on a new book, I believe, about 10 plagues. With such an accomplished guest, we are in for an insightful discussion on a fascinating topic. Today, we are diving into a topic that has intrigued historians and scholars for centuries. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? There are various theories, and many of them are fringe. Professor Kenneth Kitchen, some proponents of those theories, has even called time wasters, if I'm correct.
That's correct.
Okay, I will start our presentation. We have one, and we will go question by question. Do you see presentation?
I see the presentation.
All right, and first question is, who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and what arguments would you present to support your position?
Okay, I would say that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramses II. Now, we base this on a couple of historical bookends, okay? On the one hand, you have Exodus 1:11 that says that the Israelites built the storage cities of Ramses and Pithom. Now, those are very, very specific cities, and and when we talk about, say, storage cities, we're talking about here storage silos, essentially. Okay, they're storage magazines. They're meant to hold food for temple offerings. Okay, but in the case of the city of Ramses, we know that that could not have been any earlier than 1288 BC. Pithom was called Pithom. It was actually a renaming that was done by Ramses II. Before that, it was just called the city of Cheku. So it's a name that's specific to the time period of Ramses II. And the city actually had been abandoned. Pithom had actually been abandoned between the reigns of Thutmose III and Seti I. Ramses II reoccupies it, builds a temple to Atum there, which is where the city gets its name from. Pithom, Peratum, it's the same name. And he turns it into a border fortress, essentially. Okay, so that's our one bookend, is that the Israelites have this activity where they actually build things in 1288 BC. On the other end is their first mention in the Merneptah victory stela as having been in Canaan. This is the victory stela where King Merneptah briefly talks about his police action against the city of Gezer. Now, we know that that campaign had to take place before the date of that stela, and that stela is dated about 1217 BC. So there's a 71-year window there for there to be an Exodus, where you have our last sighting of the Israelites in Egypt, and then followed by their first sighting in Canaan. So there's a 71-year window there. Well, there aren't too many kings who reigned in that. There's only two kings that reigned in that window. Ramses II, who reigned for 66 years, and Merneptah. So you don't have a lot of options here. Now, in the case of, say, Ramses, his firstborn son dies in around 1265 BC. So that sort of narrows the range down even further. So now we're in about a 45-year window. So that limits who it can be now. So if we take into account the wandering in the wilderness being about 40 years, we can say, okay, that death of that particular firstborn is probably identifies the king as Ramses II. So that's the basic argument there.
Okay, so multiple arguments from archaeology, Bible, and similar. So nice.
This is actually pretty normal for ancient history. For ancient history, you don't have one sort of piece of evidence that just nails it. You usually have, say, a pile of evidence that helps you narrow down the options. Basically, what we would call an inductive argument.
Great. Now, objection is from Dr. Ronald Handel. The city of Pi-Ramzes, built by Ramses II, doesn't show signs of sudden departure or mass destruction consistent with the biblical plagues and the Exodus. And he says, quote, yeah, okay, answer and yeah.
Okay. Let's take that first bit, and then we'll break down the second bit. Okay. Now, the first bit, the city of Pi-Ramzes, built by Ramses II, did not show signs of sudden departure or mass destruction. We wouldn't expect it to. Simply put, we wouldn't expect it to. The plagues weren't the sort of things that destroyed buildings. The plagues were the sort of things that affected livestock, agriculture, persons. They didn't destroy buildings. So, the Bible doesn't claim that Pi-Ramzes suffered destruction, nor does it claim that Pi-Ramzes was abandoned. It said that the Israelites left the land of Goshen. The difference here is that Avaris is not the same as Pi-Ramzes. They're two different cities. Now, they happen to be right next door to each other. If you go there today and you look at it, the old site of Pi-Ramzes, which is Tel Kantir, was in ancient times an island. It had water flowing all around it. So the Israelites didn't directly leave from Pi-Ramzes. They left from the field outside of Pi-Ramzes to the south of it, south of the river, which is also the same side of the bank of the river that Avaris is on. And pretty much everyone who believes in the historical Exodus thinks that the Israelites were residents of the city of Avaris. And the two cities are separated not just by water, but also by about 2 kilometers. So they're going to leave Avaris, and we do actually have evidence of Avaris being abandoned around in the 1260s. So in the mid-dynasty, 19th dynasty, we discovered that Avaris, most of the city, except for the dock district, was abandoned and turned into a cemetery, a Ramesside cemetery. Now, it begs the question of why would they need a large cemetery like that, but I'll leave that up to your viewers to kind of figure out on their own. So I think that covers that first part. There's no suggestion by the Bible that Pi-Ramzes was destroyed. There's no suggestion in the Bible that Pi-Ramzes was abandoned through the Exodus. And historically, we know that Pi-Ramzes was a city of Egyptians, not Semites. The Semites are living next door to Avaris. So there's this sort of separation of peoples here. Now, did you want to read that second one?
Yeah. What about second part? He says, Paul's argument is not compelling. There is no reason that the abandonment of Avaris or any particular city, even if it contains vast residents, needs to correspond to the Exodus. Abandonment of cities happens all the time for all sorts of reasons. Is it true?
Oh, sure. It's true that abandonment of cities happens all the time for all sorts of reasons. One of those reasons could actually be the Exodus. All right, now what he's doing here is a kind of correlation does not equal causation argument. That's what he's doing here. Okay, he's saying, well, just because the city of Avaris was abandoned doesn't mean we can attribute it to the Israelites. And just because they were Semites, so you can't just attribute it to the Israelites. And just because the time is right, you just can't attribute it to the Israelites. So it's a correlation does not equal causation argument. There's a problem with his argument here. Okay. Now, have you ever seen that meme of there's a gate blown open and a duck walks through it? And the meme says correlation does not equal causation. Okay, the duck didn't break down the gate. Okay, now if they had done that same meme with a bulldozer instead of a duck, we would go, well, yeah, correlation doesn't equal causation, but the probability is high that a bulldozer would have bashed down that gate. Okay. The problem here with it is that Handel does not consider that there is actually criteria for determining causal relationships. Okay. And there's 7 sort of pieces of criteria that are often used to say, okay, that if a probability is high for a correlation to equal a causation. First criteria, is there a strength of association? Is there some strength of association? Can you say that Israelites are Asiatic Semites? Well, yes, you can. Is there a claim out there that they lived in Egypt? Yes, there is. Is there a claim that they lived in a specific part of Egypt called Goshen that we also just happen to find in Egyptian records? Yes, there is. Did Goshen actually exist? Yes, it did. So we would call this a strength of association. There's also consistence. That's another criteria for correlation, for causation, causal relationships. Is the account consistent with what we know of the facts on the ground? Well, yes. The Israelites claim to have left from an area near Pi-Ramzes. We do have a consistency of a people group leaving Avaris at that time. The third is specificity. Is the correlation specific enough to infer a causal relationship? Well, here we got a group of Israelites leaving 40 years from a specific place. That's mentioned in not just Egyptian texts, but in Egyptian Israelite texts. Yeah, there's specificity here. The fifth criteria is plausibility. Is it plausible for Israelites to have left Egypt at this time? Now, we'll probably get into more of that as we go along here, but there's nothing prima facie that's implausible about it. So if it's not implausible, it's plausible. Coherence is the sixth criteria. Would the causation contradict other established facts? Quick answer to that's no. And then finally, analogy. Have we encountered similar causal relationships in the past? Yes. Yes, we have. The abandonment of the so-called Exodus of the Hyksos is an example of an Exodus type event occurring from Egypt. So there is a past causal relationship that we have encountered that's similar. So this wouldn't be a one-off. So while Handel, makes that correlation does not equal causation, he's also not looking at, say, what would constitute a causal relationship. And he ignores all those factors when he does his critique here. So he's equating this to the duck correlation when he should be equating it to the bulldozer correlation. He does a lot of arguments like this. This is not, he does these sort of, well, it might be some kind of Israelite thing, but it's not those Israelites. So he does these sort of weird arguments at times. This is very typical of Handel's approach to things.
This is just great. Thank you. This is really detailed, and let me share next one. Since you're expert on Ark of the Covenant, that's your PhD. Do you believe that any specific detail in the description of the Ark of the Covenant or the tabernacle and its furnishings point specifically and exclusively to the period of Ramses II?
Not specifically to the period of Ramses II. Okay, now what it does do is it points us to a range. Like, for example, the two facing goddesses that we find in, say, sacred barks. Those are basically, how do I say this? The inspiration for the two facing cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. And we find that those date between Amun-her-kepešef III and Ramses X. Okay. And that's probably about as specific as it gets. So it does look to be like it is Ramesside, especially when you start getting into stuff like Uraeus friezes and, say, the winged vulture stuff, which we don't find on the Ark of the Covenant. But we do see that sort of imagery is used on other parts of the tabernacle. So it's one of those things where it gives us a broad range, late Dynasty 18 into the Ramesside period, but it's not narrow enough to pin it to one king.
Can you give one example, just what fits that period?
For example, the bark of Amun-Re that's found on the reliefs at Luxor Temple have those two cherubim goddesses facing each other with their wings stretched out, and they're covering the sacred space of the god. Now, in the case of the Ark of the Covenant, we have two cherubim, one on each side of the mercy seat, and their wings cover the lid. They're facing each other, just like what we would see on the reliefs at Luxor. And they're covering the sacred space, because we have to remember that the sacred space for the Ark of the Covenant is not inside the chest. It's on top of the chest. It's between the wings of the cherubim. This is where we're told that the Shekinah glory would come. The Shekinah glory is not inside the box. It's on top of the box, between the wings of the cherubim. This is very similar to what we find also in, say, Egyptian thrones, where the sacred space of the king is the seat. He's seated in the sacred space. And he's being carried around in this sacred throne for everyone to see his majesty and glory, while his throne has protective goddesses that have their wings around him. So we see several examples of this in Egyptian furnishing, and it's very commutative to what we know of the Ark of the Covenant. So it does seem that the Ark of the Covenant dates to that period, as I said, between Amenhotep III and Ramses X. One of the things it does seem to, though, exclude is any period before Amenhotep III or any period after the Ramses X. So this is something that's, while it doesn't narrow it down to a single king, it also excludes other possibilities. Like, for example, that's going to exclude an Amenhotep II exodus, because they're building that Ark of the Covenant in the first year after coming out of Egypt. So that is, you don't find these type of furnishings prior to Amenhotep III. They start with Amenhotep III. So the fit of the Ark of the Covenant into the narrative of biblical history is going to be much later than Amenhotep II. It's also going to be earlier than Ramses X. So it's going to be much earlier than say the Iron Age. So it's not something that's going to be the result of, say, a manufacture in Canaan, when they sort of settle into Canaan and become established there.
All right, so early Exodus is excluded, and also mythicists in Iron Age, I believe 7th or 8th century, they say. Yeah. Nice, thank you. Next question. Do we find evidence that Ramses II actually came into contact with Hebrews? Specifically, Egyptian records from the time of Ramses II don't mention the loss of a large number of slaves. If yes, did he treat them as described in the book of Exodus, wiping them, etc.?
Okay, well, did Ramses II come in contact with Hebrews? Absolutely. He was born at Avaris. Ramses II was born at Avaris. He was not even a crown prince at the time. You know, he wouldn't become basically in line for the throne until his grandfather, Ramses I, comes to the throne. When Ramses II was born, his grandfather was still vizier of Lower Egypt. So this whole thing about did he have contact with the Hebrews? Absolutely. His whole family had contact with Hebrews. His ancestors, the Ramesside clan, has its power base in Goshen. They were the generals that got the land after the conquest of Egypt by Ahmose I. So they had a lot of interactions with Semitic Asiatics at Avaris. This is their home territory. This is where their power base is. They grew up there. I mean, Seti I was, he lived until his 20s at Avaris. So, because Ramses II's grandfather, Ramses I, only reigned for about 2 years. So the family picks up from Avaris. They go from Avaris when Ramses I becomes king. He goes to Thebes and rules at Thebes for 2 years. And then Seti I reigns for another 11 to 15 years at Thebes. Ramses II, then, when he comes to the throne, he doesn't stay at Thebes. He returns to his homeland at Avaris. And that's where he starts building his capital, at that virgin site of Kantir. So there's no question he had interaction with Semitic Asiatics. Just none question. They would have been household servants. They would have been everywhere. Now, Ramses II does not mention a large loss of slaves. There is very few records of that period. Okay, we just don't see any records, period. We also wouldn't find it on religious inscriptions. Okay, so like 95, 99% of all the documents we have from Egypt are religious documents. They're votive stele, they're praise texts that are put on the walls of temples. Temples are not places of where people recorded history. They're places where people recorded offerings to gods. Okay, so in the case of, say, Pi-Ramzes, or the large loss of slaves, you would never record that on a temple wall anyway. You don't record your failures on temple walls. You record your victories on temple walls. That's where you would record them. So it wouldn't even make sense to say that in these religious documents where you're supposed to be basically saying the best victories you've done, your greatest accomplishments in life, the unspotted lamb of your offerings. You're not going to put your failures up there. That wouldn't make any sense. Now, as to did he treat them in the book of Exodus by whipping them? Yeah, sure. Look, Egypt was a beating culture. They beat you all the time for anything. Okay. If you were just, say, an ordinary average citizen and the local constable suspected you of something, and even if he didn't suspect you, he sometimes just gave you a good beating. Okay. They didn't beat you, or question you, then beat you. They beat you, then question you. They thought that they couldn't get the truth out of you until you've had a good beating. So they beat everybody. Everyone got a good beating now and again. So what would make slaves so special that they wouldn't get a good beating from time to time in a culture like that? Of course they got whipped. They're beating everybody.
Great point. Just someone cannot imagine that Ramses II was that guy who did that, but yeah, it makes sense.
Everybody got beat. I mean, we have records of some officials getting a beating. I mean, you took a look at the tomb robbery papyri, and the Magi and the scribe of the mayor of Thebes has to go through the villages and basically interrogating all these people who worked on the tombs. Some of them were minor officials too. And every sort of thing, every time it's like, well, gave them a good beating and asked some questions. That's how Egypt worked. It was a beating culture. Still is, actually. They don't waste time with prisons when they can just beat you.
Yeah, that's interesting that they first got beaten and then asked questions. You explained that in other interviews.
It's fascinating. Yeah. It's fascinating. I remember when I went over this particular text with my professor, and it's like, he asked, well, is this out of order? I said, oh, no. This seems to be the normal pattern. Beat first, ask questions. And it comes down to this, like, it's sort of the mindset that you can't get the truth, that people will automatically lie. People automatically lie. You have to beat them to break down their capacity to lie. So that seems to be what their culture was like. Was they beat you to get the truth out of you. If they really wanted the truth, they beat you first.
Good answer. Next question, does Ramses II psychologically fit as the person who truly engaged in dialogue with Moses and Aaron and in the way described in the Bible? Can you really imagine Ramses II talking with Moses just as it is written in the scripture? Some would say that he doesn't seem like a person who was so hard-hearted and faced with such a crisis and threat from a deity named Yahweh. What's your response?
I always think these psychological profiles are tricky. Okay. Anytime you try to establish a psychological profile with limited data, you're bound to get things wrong in some respect. Now, was he the sort of person who could intellectually, or who would engage a Semitic Asiatic? The answer to this would be probably no. It would probably be no under most circumstances. You had a difference in social status. We have to remember that Egypt is a stratified culture. Every tier of the social strata has its basically limitations to who can talk to who. And if you were out, if you couldn't appeal to somebody very high up the ranks of the social ladder very easily. Now, in the case of Semitic Asiatics who were slaves, they're second from the bottom in the ranking here. The king is at the very top. So under normal circumstances, a Semitic Asiatic would not have the social status to interact with the king. What made this an unusual situation was that Moses had an in. He was the adopted son of a daughter of a king. Now, that doesn't give you many rights. In fact, it only gives you one right, which is an audience with a king. If you're a prince or somehow related to the royal family in some way, you had the right to have your grievances redressed by the king. It's the only right you had, really. So all these, 50, 60 sons of the king didn't have very many rights, except for maybe the crown prince himself. But all those had that right of redress because they're going to go off and they're going to go do jobs. After the king ascends to the throne and he has his 50 kids, those kids are going to, some of them are going to go in the military, some of them are going to go into become scribes, some of them are going to become administrators of regional monarchs, nomarchs, governors, that sort of thing. Okay. And it's going to come about that when there go out from the royal court, those sons and daughters of the king are going to encounter life situations that they need the king to address. So they had that right to come back to the royal court and have an audience with the king to get redress. So as the son of a daughter of a king, Moses had that right of redress. But that's really his only right here. So under those circumstances, yes, we can assume that he had standing. And if you can have standing, you can have redress. It's no different than, say, in a court situation where you can't bring a case to court unless you have standing to do so. Like, for example, if you see a car accident on the street, you can't go to court and sue one driver for emotional damages because you weren't involved in the accident. You don't have standing. Now, if you were one of the injured parties in that car accident, you have standing. You've been injured. You have a cause that needs redress. And we see this happen in, say, the strike papyri that we found at Medina, Deir el-Medina, where a Magi had standing with both, say, the mayor of Thebes and the workers at Deir el-Medina. The workers at Deir el-Medina trusted the Magi as a member of their community and a community leader. The Magi had standing with the court, the mayor of Thebes. He also had a personal relationship to the next guy up in rank, who was the vizier of Upper Egypt. So he had standing to go before the mayor of Thebes, and he had the respect of the community he represented. Same thing with Moses. Moses had standing with the royal court, but he also had the respect of the Semitic Asiatic community. That's why he could be a liaison here. Now, as far as Ramses II personality, we don't know that much about his personality. We do know he was given to some rash things sometimes. Like, for example, at the Battle of Kadesh, where the Hittites lay a trap. They lay a trap. They basically open the gates of Kadesh and make the town look abandoned. And it's a trap. The chariots of Ramses II rush into Kadesh, and then the Hittites sweep in on them. Come out of the hills, sweep in on them, and just obliterate a lot of Ramses' chariots. So there is a rashness to him in some of these dealings. He will sometimes charge in when prudence says, well, maybe that's not such a good idea. But apart from that, we know very little about his personality. We don't have any court records from the time. We don't have any third-party testimonies about his character. So it's hard to say what he was like psychologically. The only thing we really know is that he sometimes was given to rash decisions.
All right, you mentioned Deir el-Medina. There was a strike about 100 years later than Exodus. And do you see that similar event like crisis in the time of Moses and Ramses II? And, yeah.
Well, the two events are very similar in some ways. Okay. And what's so similar about them is the way, how do you say it? Workers' actions, strike actions were done. Okay. Like, for example, the Magi at the workers' strike, he tells the people at Deir el-Medina, he tells them, okay, when you strike work, you should do it on your day off. Okay? So it's not really a strike. Okay? It says you're just taking your half day off that you normally get, and you're just not doing any extra work on that half day off. Okay? Also, leave the tools at your home. Lock them up at home so Pharaoh doesn't think you're stealing his tools. Don't go down to the port so Pharaoh doesn't think you're running away. The Magi is treating this worker's action like he's living in a totalitarian state. And that's because he is living in a totalitarian state. Egypt was a military dictatorship. They would think nothing about breaking the skulls of some protesters. So every strike action has to be done with care because you are doing this within the confines of a totalitarian state. And we find something very, very similar in how the Israelites also do this. So this does seem to be a late bronze form of worker protest. You know, in the case of the Israelites, they're told, continue to make your quota of bricks. You know, don't stop work. Continue to make bricks. You know, don't steal tools. You know, this is still a totalitarian state. Pharaoh is still the dictator. You know, and we will have, and one of the interesting things we really find in, say, the workers' strike at Deir el-Medina is the Magi says to the mayor of Thebes, he says to the mayor of Thebes, okay, please resume the shipments of food, bread, fish, and wine you promised. Okay? And if you don't deliver this, I'll go to the next step up, which is the vizier, and he will grant this. Now, we find the same sort of method being used with the Exodus. Moses is standing in the court. He goes to the court, and he says to the Pharaoh, okay, let my people go so they can worship in the wilderness. And if you won't grant this, I'll go to the next step up, which is Yahweh. And he'll grant it for us. It's the same methods. It's the exact same methods. It just seems to be the way that people in the late Bronze Age did their civil protests. Work still got done. The Pharaoh could not be unhappy about that the work was still getting done. But at the same time, too, the protest was being made known to the king, and basically with this ominous threat of deity action if he didn't comply. Now, of course, the Pharaoh had ways of trying to quash the strike, which was he restricted the amount of straw, but still demanded the quota be met. We also find that those quotas are a feature of Egyptian brick making. Like we find the quotas mentioned in Papyrus Anastasi 3. So it's something that this does seem to be a lot of the features of what the Israelites describe in their brick making is found in Egyptian texts.
This is new for me. Okay, many new informations and really interesting. And so this is not impossible scenario, like some would say. So we see examples like this. Okay, next question. How is it possible that slaves could just leave during the reign of Ramses II, given that he was certainly one of the most powerful Egyptian rulers in the history? You mentioned that there were less than 100,000 people left Egypt during the Exodus. For example, Dr. Mark Jensen would say that there were about 200 or 250,000 slaves in the New Kingdom. So what is your opinion? How much of them were Israelites? And do we find evidence that Egypt faced a shortage of slaves during the period, or that slaves were later bought in larger number to compensate for this?
Okay, there's a couple things here. First of all, the first question here of is it possible that slaves could just leave during the reign of Ramses II? I've heard that sometimes that, there's no evidence of slaves escaping. Well, they didn't exactly escape. They were forced out. Okay? If you read the Exodus text carefully, this is not a jailbreak. They're not just going, yeah, the guards aren't looking, let's go. They're told to leave. After the night of the Passover, Pharaoh's had enough. He sends a message to Moses saying, get out. Get out, go worship your God, take your children and your wife and your cattle and all that you own, and you get out. And we see that in Exodus 12, verses 31 to 33. And it even says in verse 33, and the Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we all shall be dead, end quote. That's not escaping. That's an invitation to leave. There's the door. Go use it. Okay. That's how you could get all those people orderly exit the area in an orderly fashion. They're not just saying, oh, we're going to sneak out in the dead of night. They're doing this in broad daylight in the morning. They're doing this in broad daylight, and all the Egyptians want them to go. Okay, so this is not escape. This is we want to get rid of you. This is an expulsion. Okay. Now, as far as the shortage of slaves is concerned, we do have to understand that while there was about 250,000 slaves in Egypt as a total, not all of them were in Goshen. They were spread out through the land. There was still Semitic slaves in, say, Thebes after the time of the Exodus. We find that, for example, in the Semitic house at Medina Habu. So that would probably have been Semitic slaves that lived there in the 12th century. So there's still some Semitic slaves in Egypt after the Exodus, and not all the slaves would have left. Now, we also have to realize, too, that when the Israelites do leave, which is around the 25th regnal year of Ramses II, most of his major constructions are already done. And the Israelites aren't making, say, the sophisticated stonework. That's done by craftsman class. That's a specialized class of Egyptian craftsmen that do stonework. It was how do I say this? It was almost a guild-like arrangement. So these were jobs that were highly coveted and highly protected and done by very, very skilled laborers. You didn't have slaves do these things. So what the Israelites did was they made mud brick. And mud brick was used in the construction of storage silos for food. Like, for example, you didn't have currency back then. What you would do is you would store food in these storage silos that would be good for almost ever. Wheat, grains, salted meats, that sort of thing. And these storage silos would keep the food cool in the day, warm at night, so they wouldn't develop, they wouldn't perspire and form mold inside the containers. So that was the purpose of those storage silos. Now, the other use of mud brick was for making residential buildings, like houses, homes, retaining walls, palaces would be made out of mud brick. So these are places that people lived in. Now, by this point, Pharaoh already had his palace. He already had his palace. He didn't need another one. most of his temple at the Ramesseum had already been built. So his mortuary temple at the Ramesseum had already been constructed. Most of the work of the hypostyle court at Karnak Temple had been finished, as well as the outer court of Luxor Temple. He was still working on the temple at Abu Simbel, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of storage magazines used there. So most of his construction work had already been done and completed. So there was really it was really just more adding to what already existed. So the loss of the Israelites wouldn't have been a major impact upon the economy of Egypt. So it's one of those things that probably wouldn't have even been worth mentioning. Maybe in a day roll, but we don't have any day rolls from that period.
So he doesn't need more slaves because he finished all his work. Am I correct?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. There wasn't the demand. At this point, slaves would have been mouths to feed. So it was basically, well, we could always use more mud brick to build more storage silos. But apart from that, they didn't actually have a driving need to keep them. Because again, they didn't do a lot of the big construction labor. That was all done by specialist craftsmen.
Okay, and out of 250,000 slaves, how much they are Israelites? Can you answer that?
We don't really know for sure. The city of Avaris had between 5 and 50,000 people. We're not exactly sure of the exact figures there. But let's just say something in between about 30,000-ish. There's probably another 10 to 30,000 at Pithom. You'll have a few thousands that are scattered through the area of Goshen and the Wadi Tumalat. So you could say probably about 50K. That would probably not be an unreasonable size for the Exodus.
Okay. Great. And were all Israelites went out, or maybe some of them stay inside Egypt? What is your
Some of them could have. Sure,
Mhm.
some of them could have. We do have evidence of some Semitic slaves staying in Egypt. Okay.
Mhm.
Not so much around Avaris, though. For some reason, most of those guys left. That's because essentially after the Exodus, the whole city sort of shuts down. It shuts down except for the port. There was a deep sea port that was used at Avaris called Peru Nefer that was still in operation until the late Ramesside period. That seems to be the only portion of Avaris that remained in operation throughout its entire history. But it was such an important port to the area that because the city of Ramses itself did not have a deep water port. Its banks were too shallow for a deep water port. So they had to keep that port at Avaris in operation even after the city was no longer viable as a city. But after the vast majority of people left Avaris, most of the city just shut down. You can't maintain a city without people. Even if you have a few stragglers. If you had some people who said, yeah, I don't want to go, they would have probably have either moved their residences closer to the port, or they would have moved to Pi-Ramzes.
Okay, good job. Let's move next. I will share again screen. Is it realistic that the Israelites were in the desert for 40 years? James Hofmeyr says that they spent most of their time in Kadesh Barnea because of the water. And this is the same place where Ramses II won a battle in 1274 BC. Why didn't the Egyptians come out and subdue them during that time?
Okay. Not the same Kaddish.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the same Kaddish. Kadesh Barnea is not the same place as the Battle of Kadesh.
Oh.
Two different places. Okay. Kadesh Barnea is in the Sinai. Kadesh, the Battle of Kadesh was at Kadesh on the Orontes in Syria. Different places. Similar name, but different places. Okay. So it's not the same place. Now, that doesn't take away from the other two questions, but it is just one of those things that it's just like, okay, I saw that. It's like, okay, that's not the same place. Now, why didn't the Egyptians come out and subdue them at that time? That is a fair question. Why didn't they go out to Kadesh Barnea and subdue them? Oh, that's because their chariots were destroyed. That whole Sea of Reeds thing that destroyed the chariots, that would have prevented them from coming out and pursuing them. And we find that that Ramses' last campaign into the Levant is in his 18th regnal year. He never campaigns again after that. That's the last one. And the Exodus takes place around the 25th regnal year. So either Ramses doesn't want to pursue them or can't pursue them. So take your choice on that one. Now, is it realistic that the Israelites were in the desert for 40 years? Sure. Bedouin wander the Sinai all the time. Now, we do have to understand, too, that in the late Bronze Age, the Sinai wasn't the desert it is today. It was a savanna. We have lots of records from the ancient Egyptians of Shasu pasturing flocks in the Sinai. Okay. In the Middle Kingdom period, the Shasu had herds of cattle. They had herds of cattle that they were grazing in the Sinai. Now, you can't do herds of cattle unless you've got A, lots of water, and B, lots of silage. It's impossible to do this without both. And yet, somehow, Shasu are able to herd cattle in the Sinai. Yeah, as I said, the only way that's possible is if the Sinai was a savanna, at least during the Middle Kingdom. And then they make that transition, the Shasu make the transition from cattle to sheep and goats in the late Bronze Age. We also know, for example, that it had to have been a savanna because in Exodus 3, verse 1, when Moses pastures his flock, he takes them to the west side of the wilderness of Midian. Now, the wilderness of Midian covers Arabia and the eastern portion of the Sinai. Moses is not a dummy. He's not taking his flocks and pasturing them out into a barren wasteland. That would be a death sentence for his flocks. He knows that there are grasslands still out in the Sinai. And as late as, say, the Ramesside period, they are still finding trees and wood in the Sinai Peninsula. How do we know this? Because there's large slag pits at Serbet al-Qadam. What's a slag pit? Slag pit is the result of smelting copper ore. Okay. Now, how you smelt copper ore is you make these large furnaces and you put in lots of wood. Where do they get the wood from? They didn't get it from Egypt. They got it from the Sinai. There used to be native species of acacia, almond trees, even some olive trees out there. And they would chop these down and use them for fire in smelting operations at Serbet al-Qadam. That's the only way you can account for the massive, massive amounts of slag pits that we find there, slag hills, mounds that we find there. So there's no question that during the late Bronze Age, there would have been a savanna in the Sinai. As I said, the records of the Shasu bear this out. The records of from the Middle Bronze period of some of the nomads we find there seem to also indicate that at one point the Sinai had a lot more resources than it does today. We even know, for example, that the Neolithic, the end of the Neolithic wet period was a gradual process. For example, we also know that the Sahara, which is completely desert today, was a savanna up until the end of the Old Kingdom. We do know that the Sahara dried out before the Sinai. So we know that around the end of the Old Kingdom, the Sahara desertified completely. But up until that point, they would get like elephants, wildebeest, giraffes, lions, and rhinos come right up to the Nile. So, you know, you didn't get those species. Those species are not indigenous to Egypt proper. They're migratory species that wandered in off of the Sahara. But we do see these recorded on the ivory handles of knife blades or knife handles. So there's lots of evidence to show us that the Sahara was a savanna until the end of the Old Kingdom, and the Sinai seems to have been a savanna at least into the late Bronze Age, but it was coming to an end pretty quickly after that. So basically, they wandered around the same way the Bedouin do. The Bedouin have been wandering around the Sinai for millennia. They go from watering hole to watering hole, oasis to oasis. When you get like a torrential rain, which the Sinai sometimes does, there's a big wadi, huge wadi that covers 3/4 of the Sinai called the Wadi Aresh. And a wadi is a seasonal river. There's a torrential rain that creates flooding and a river down this wadi. And it covers about, as I said, about 3/4 of the Sinai. Now, it hasn't rained there in a long time, but we still see the evidence of the wadi. It's still there. And when those rains would have happened, there would have been fields and flowers that would have just sprung up. And that's would have been what would have been the pasture, constituted the pasture lands for many of these nomadic tribes.
Amazing. But why don't we find anything in Kadesh Barnea? Because they were almost 40 years there, and we find nothing about Israel.
Oh, that one's easy. It's a floodplain. Kadesh Barnea is a floodplain. The only things we find really there are there's a couple of fortresses there, and that has been sort of a buffer against the flooding. Now, there was some, it actually flooded this year. Kadesh Barnea flooded this year. And there were videos going around of these torrential floods going through Kadesh Barnea. So Kadesh Barnea is a floodplain. It's one of the reasons we don't find much at Kadesh Barnea, because of the flooding just washes it all away. And if you've ever seen some of these wadis and how people have died in wadis, people have died by being carried away by the water. There was one famous archaeologist who got caught in a wadi and didn't get out. He didn't get out because the water just drowned him. It came like it was like 1 minute he's in a dry wadi, the next it's a wall of water. And it's that sudden with some of these wadis. And Kadesh Barnea is on a floodplain of a wadi. That's why we don't find much there. It's all been washed away.
All right, I heard that story. It's terrible. Yeah, he was a great archaeologist. Okay, next about Ipuwer papyrus. Yeah, does that indicate something recently happened in their experience that they would recognize as fulfilled prophecy, which of course relates to the 10 plagues?
It's possible that the copy of the Ipuwer papyrus would have been meaningful to those of, say, the Ramesside period. We do know that the Ipuwer papyrus dates to the late 12th dynasty. Okay, so it's much, much earlier than, say, the Exodus itself. Much earlier. Ipuwer papyrus is still talking about the construction of pyramids, which had ended in the first reign of the 18th dynasty. So we do know that it's a Middle Kingdom papyrus. We do know that it's late 12th dynasty in all likelihood. But there was a fascination with these prophetic texts at two periods in time. And it's not just the Ipuwer papyrus, it's also, say, the prophecy of Nefertiti is another example. There's a third one as well. There's several of these prophetic genre texts that date to the Middle Kingdom. But almost all the copies we find of these prophecy texts, even though they all date to the Middle Kingdom, almost all the copies we find are either in one of two periods. They're either very early Dynasty 18 or mid Dynasty 19. And there seems to be very little exception to this. Like, for example, I think we have like 3 or 4 copies of Nefertiti that date to the reign of Ahmose I. Of course, he's seen as a conquering king over the Semites. Yeah, I can see where the figure of a many would see back then as basically, oh, he's the savior king against the Semites. But we find that most of the copies of Nefertiti date to mid Dynasty 19. That is one heck of a coincidence. One heck of a coincidence. So it is, I mean, it's not like anybody had the Bible at the time of the Exodus. The Bible hadn't been written yet. Nobody had a way to make sense of these things. So the only resources the Egyptians had to make sense of, say, these plagues were these Middle Kingdom prophecy texts. And you do find, for example, in the Ipuwer papyrus, it does say that the Nile turned to blood, and yet the people drank from it. You have the sun being blotted out. You had the rise of the Semites. You had all these sort of, what would we call recurrent meteorological events. Basically, these events that happened before, during the first intermediate period, that were, in many respects, events that just seem to recur with the Nile inundation. So we wouldn't call these supernatural events, we'd call these hypernatural events. Like, for example, a particularly strong earthquake would be a hypernatural event. Doesn't happen very often, but still natural. The water turning to blood seems to be a hypernatural event. It seems to be an event that doesn't happen often, but has happened more than once in Egypt's history. Same thing with the blotting of the sun. Doesn't seem to have happened often in Egypt's history, but it does seem to be a natural event that occurred more than once. So just about all the events here, because they are hypernatural in nature, they're seen as unusual. unusual. There's some sort of disturbance among the gods. So the Egyptians have to go to their old texts to figure out what's going on, because that's what you do as a good Egyptian. You don't know what's going on. You go to your texts and you try to figure it out. And in this case, the only resource they have to fall back on are these Middle Kingdom prophecy texts.
All right, this is so interesting. Let's continue. Next famous question: did the pharaoh die in the sea? Many images from Egypt depict the pharaoh leading the army, which would fit with many texts on the screen. Besides, is it realistic for the pharaoh of the Exodus to continue living until the conquest of Canaan by Israel?
Okay. Answer the first question. Did the pharaoh die in the Exodus or in the sea? The answer is no. He didn't die in the sea. Okay. And the text doesn't say he died in the sea. Now, some people do confuse, say, some of these passages with the person of Pharaoh itself. Like, for example, in these ancient war texts, the marshaling of an army is seen as the extension of the king himself. Like when we say, for example, well, the King of England went to war against France. He didn't always go himself, but the army went. It's still, though, the same sort of deal where it says the king went to war, even if he stayed home. Egyptians did the same thing. In the Nubian conquest stela of Tutmosis II, the king went and conquered Nubia. Well, he didn't. The king stayed at home in his palace because he was a minor. He was underage. Okay. He was only like 12, I think. He was too young to lead an army. But it's presented as if he went there personally and conquered the Nubians. Okay. So this type of language is often used in conquest and war texts. So this is very common language where it would say that those who went out and pursued the Israelites, well, that was Pharaoh himself. It was Pharaoh's command. And because it's his command, the army is an extension of the king himself. Now, in the case of Psalm 136, that is what we would call a traditional rendering. Now, when it says in that text, Pharaoh drowned in the sea, the Hebrew doesn't say drowned. That's basically a traditional rendering that's done to... I hate these traditional renderings, honestly, because I encounter them so frequently and they had so much confusion. You know, they were done at a time when people had a certain conception of what the Bible should read, and translators use these traditional renderings so they don't get complaints about the translation.
Yeah, like Red Sea or something.
Yeah, like Red Sea is an example. Mercy Seat is another. Even in, like, we even do this in, say, New Testament texts too. Like, for example, John 3:16. Whosoever believes. Well, whosoever's not in the text. It's the believing ones. So we do these traditional renderings to keep the readership happy, but they do add confusion to the text. And when Psalm 136:15 is rendered that Pharaoh and his army drowned, that's not the translation of that word. The translation of that word is brush off. Pharaoh and his army were brushed off in the sea. What that's supposed to connote is that Pharaoh and his army was like insects, like flies. A fly lands on your arm, you brush it off. Pharaoh and his army, nothing to God. He brushes them off with the sea. That's what that's supposed to connote. So there's a lot there that's not in the text that our traditional translations sort of insert in there. But there's no evidence at all in the Bible that Pharaoh himself was present at the Sea of Reeds. There's no evidence for it at all. Now, is it realistic that the Pharaoh continued to live out until the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites? Sure. Here's one of the things we do know about kings that live a very long life. Okay? Kings that have very long reigns end up with weakened dynasties. Almost across the board. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter if it's an Egyptian king, a French king, a British king, doesn't matter. If a king lives a very long life, there's no new blood, there's no new ideas, and the kingdom stagnates. So we've seen this with the British monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II had an incredibly long reign. The monarchy is not in a great position these days. Not looking good for them. Well, it was also true at the time of Ramses. Ramses had a 66-year reign. Incredibly long reign. Pepi II had an incredibly long reign. He reigned 90 years. Doesn't get much longer than that. But after both those kings, you had a decline in the monarchy. You had a decline after Pepi II. You had a decline after Ramses II. In fact, what's going to happen, say, in the case of Ramses II, is Merneptah is going to have a lot of problems. His successor, Merneptah, is in his 60s when he takes the throne. Okay? And he's only going to reign for 10 years. Even though he was a general, his capacity to wage war would be very, very limited by the time of when he takes the throne. He does one police action into Canaan, where he basically goes up the coastal plain, comes down the Shephelah. He doesn't even campaign across the whole thing. He just goes down the Shephelah right to Gezer. He conquers Gezer because the Canaanite king Gezer is destroying garrison towns. And then he goes home. That's all he does in Canaan. He smacks Gezer and he goes home. Then Merneptah has a disastrous encounter with the Libyans. The Libyans invade Egypt in Merneptah's 5th year. The Libyans are invading Egypt. They make it all the way to Heliopolis. Okay, now if you know where that is in Egypt, that's like the heart of Egypt. That's the center of Egypt. If they're close to Heliopolis, they're close to Memphis. And Memphis is the administrative capital of Egypt. If the Libyans had taken Memphis, it would have been all over. And it takes Merneptah 3 months to dislodge the Libyans. 3 months. This is not a kingdom that's anymore in its prime. And then following Merneptah, you have 20 years of civil war. So Ramses II was blessed with a very long life, but a weakened kingdom as a result. So, yeah, it's totally realistic that the Pharaoh of the Exodus would continue living until the conquest because it would lead to other consequences. And those consequences are a weak kingdom, a kingdom that can't really take things back from the Israelites.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. Next, how can we know that the army of Ramses II really perished in the sea? What arguments would support this? Approximately, okay, we covered that.
We covered that, and
no.
we'll just recap that. Let's just recap that.
Yeah.
You had the fact that Ramses II didn't campaign after his 18th year. No more campaigns after year 18, even though he lives another 40 years, over 40 years. Okay. We see this weakening in, say, Merneptah's struggles against the Libyans, his rather diminished campaign against Gezer, and the civil war that followed. Okay. So that's really going to be most of it there. As far as the estimates of how many soldiers died, now that was something we haven't covered, which is that Egypt had 4 professional grade armies. Okay, and each of these armies was about 2,000 men. Now they could marshal more foot soldiers from Nubian mercenaries, Semitic mercenaries, etc. They could do that. And that's what they did at Kadesh, is they had the 4 armies, plus they had a bunch of ground troops that would follow after. But of the 4 armies, 3 of the armies were half chariots, half infantry. The 4th army was all infantry. And that's the army of Set. Okay. Now, the way these chariots were distributed when they were at home and garrisoned was that 3/4 of them were posted in the East Nile, where there was the big threat, and 1/4 of them would be posted in the West, El Alamein. El Alamein had a Ramesside fort where 1/4 of the chariots were posted. Okay, so you had that distribution across Egypt. So most of them are going to be in the Eastern Sinai, or Eastern Delta. They'll be at places like Pi-Ramzes. They'll be garrisoned there. They'll be garrisoned at Charu. Charu had a lot of them. Probably the vast majority of chariots would have been stationed at Charu. And then some would have been at Migdol. So when Ramses II sends out the chariots, they're going to be essentially from those eastern forts. So Pi-Ramzes, Charu, and Migdol. And they're already in a position where they can pursue the Israelites who are sort of wandering south of the Pelusiac estuary. So the ones from Pi-Ramzes are going to come around the Pelusiac estuary, meet up with the ones at Charu, and then continue and then meet up with the ones at Migdol and go down into the desert to engage the Israelites. And there would have been at the Reed Sea about 2,300 chariots. Now the infantry doesn't catch up. Okay, the infantry are about a day behind. So even with the pillar of fire preventing them from reaching the Israelites, and these chariots had the Israelites dead to rights. Okay, if it hadn't been for that pillar of fire, they would have caught them. But that gives the Israelites that night to escape through the wind, set down that parts the waters, and then the chariots go rushing in after them. And as I said, there's about 2,300 chariots at that event. Now, there's still 1/4 of the chariots that remained of those. And Egypt still has most of its infantry intact. It's great for defensive measures, not so good for chasing people down. You need chariots if you're going to go on campaign. You need chariots because they're your mobile archery platforms. They're a mobile archery platform. They're fast. They get in and out. You had on those chariots, they were 2-man operations. One was the driver, one was an archer. The job of the driver was just to drive. He just drove the chariot. The archer, he was there to throw javelins and basically throw as many arrows at the enemy as he could. So it was really, really important if you're going campaign that you had those chariots. You couldn't do proper campaigning without those chariots. And after the Exodus, there wouldn't have been enough chariots to do proper campaigning anymore.
Good. So that fits with biblical description about 600 chariots, I believe it says.
Yeah, 600 chariots from Pi-Ramzes.
Yeah.
So just from Pi-Ramzes. So you figure in another 1,000 from Charu and some more from the other Ketem forces, and you'd have about the right number, about 2,300.
Okay. Thank you. What happened to the firstborn of Ramses II? How and when did he die? Additionally, do we find that many other firstborns died in the same year as Amun-her-kepešef? Sorry about pronunciation. I don't know how to say.
Amun-her-kepešef.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. We don't know exactly how Amun-her-kepešef died. We don't even know if we actually have the body of Amun-her-kepešef. Now, there was a big press release done by the Theban Mapping Project that they found a skull of a male in his 20s that could possibly, maybe, might be, could be possibly Amun-her-kepešef with a head injury. Okay. But we don't know if that was Amun-her-kepešef. This is the problem. It was just a skull. Just a skull. It was not a wrapped mummy. So there was no, and it was found amongst 4 other skeletons that were just randomly thrown in a pit. We don't know if this was even related to Ramses II, because we do know that people went into these tombs afterwards and buried their own dead. So, like we find this at, say, the tomb of Akhmos Nefertari, that there were several burials put in there after she had been interred there. The locals did this. The locals didn't just say rob these tombs, they also reused them. So was this a local person who had died and been buried there? You know, was he one of Ramses II's other sons? No, Ramses II had 52 sons. Okay. It could have been a later younger son that died. No, that's entirely possible. He had so many kids, and Amun-her-kepešef was the eldest. So there's a lot of opportunity there for one of his younger kids. We have to remember that a lot of his children died before he himself died. We kind of forget that Merneptah was 13th in line for the throne. 13th. That means that the previous 12 predecessors died before him. And if the previous 12 died before him, a lot of his younger brothers also died before him. So we don't know if that skull relates to Amun-her-kepešef at all. It was a guess by the Theban Mapping Project, and one, unfortunately, the press just ran with. I don't think it was even a good guess. So we don't know how he died. We just don't know how he died. Now, we do know that he died around the 25th regnal year, give or take 7 years. We don't know exact. We don't even have an exact date for his death. We do know that that Amun-her-kepešef was a father himself, and his son died prematurely because we found his tomb. Okay, we found the tomb of the son of Amun-her-kepešef. We don't know exactly when he died, but he died in childhood. So Amun-her-kepešef died as an adult. His son died. His firstborn son died as a child. We do know that there was one of the viziers of Egypt died around the same time in the 25th regnal year. As far as the rest of, say, the firstborn that died, we don't know. We don't. The problem is that the major cemetery at that time would have been Avaris. After the Israelites had left, people were burying their dead there. Okay. But that cemetery has been almost completely destroyed by agricultural leveling. So basically, the farmers go in, they till up the land, and destroy the tombs. We do know it was a cemetery, and we do know it was a mid-dynasty 19th cemetery because of all the fragments of stuff we find there. We find a lot of fragments of tombs. We find pieces of coffin there. We find pieces of Ramesside pottery there. We find little amulets there. We find all sorts of remains of tombs there, but not the cemetery itself. It's been destroyed. So we don't know exactly how many people died during that Passover. We don't know. The place where they would have been buried has been destroyed. So it's hard to get a handle on that exactly.
Can we estimate the age of that person which skeletons were found by alleged firstborn of Ramses II?
He was about 25-ish. So it would be, that would at least be consistent with Amun-her-kepešef. But again, he had so many, Ramses II had so many sons. Those tombs were reused by a lot of people. The fact that it was a 25-year-old male could fit up, or a 20-ish-year-old male could fit a lot of profiles. It's not enough to say it's Amun-her-kepešef. And I think that's the difficulty there.
Yeah, and the head of that guy was crushed. So if text says that the angel of the Lord killed firstborns, does that mean that it could fit that description, or breaking a head or something? What's your opinion?
Well, okay, let's just say, even if it was, say, he did suffer a head wound. There's a couple ways you can suffer a head wound without it being, say, the result of, say, a war, attack. This has happened before where people, get very, very ill. Let's say they're starting to suffer from a heart attack. They stand up, they get a heart attack, and they keel over, and their head hits the corner of a table. So head injuries are very, very common if you just drop dead. Because, let's face it, heads are big, bulbous, and exposed. Head injuries are very, very common in sudden death situations. There's nothing saying that the death of the firstborn had to take place while everyone was asleep. No, that's an assumption. Not everyone just was sleeping that night and woke up to dead people. Some people were walking around. Some people were expecting this coming.
Yeah, many of them think that's so. That's a good explanation.
But I don't think it's Amun-her-kepešef. That's my opinion. I just don't think it is him. Because again, too many sons, not good enough identification of the body. There's too many alternatives here for this to be a good identification.
Yes. Okay. What about Akhenaten? Early Exodus proponents say that we wouldn't expect such a crisis in Egypt to occur because Akhenaten was a monotheist or something like that. So how that fits with Exodus?
What crisis?
Oh.
No, I mean, that's a serious question. What crisis?
Yeah, they say that we have a crisis because other gods are not involved in the.
Well, that's an assumption, isn't it?
Yes.
It's an assumption that there was a crisis. There's a completely satisfactory explanation as to why, and Akhenaten was not a monotheist. He was not a monotheist. He was a monolatrous pantheist. He believed all was Aten. The other gods were manifestations of Aten. The creation was a manifestation of Aten. You're Aten. I'm Aten. Everything's Aten. That's Atenism. It's pantheism. And it's monolatrous because you only worship the Aten, who's the foundation of everything. It's not monotheist. It's not monotheist in the slightest. It's pantheist. Okay? Now, there was no crisis associated with say, Atenism. This is kind of a myth that's sort of developed over the years, especially with Cyril Aldred's book on Akhenaten. He assumed that there was a crisis and that there was pandemonium in the final years of Akhenaten, but there wasn't any. From what we know, from what the evidence best tells us, the transition between the death of Akhenaten to his successor, Smenkhare, seems to have been peaceful. Peaceful and unremarkable. And Amarna continues to be the capital of Egypt for 5 years after the death of Akhenaten. 1 year for 1 or 2 years for Smenkhare. There might be a year there of Neferuaten reigning, and then you had 3 years of Tutankhamun there before Tutankhamun says, "This Amarna place is rubbish. Let's go back to Thebes. Thebes was better." And Amarna was a rubbish place to have a capital. It really was. It was not a good place to have a capital. A terrible place to have a capital. It was too far away from, say, food production. So there was mass starvation at Amarna. So even though there wasn't crisis in Egypt overall, there were problems at Amarna. Again, terrible place to situate a city. But Akhenaten had a strong army. He had a very, very strong army. There was no question that he had a strong army. We even have records of Akhenaten going on campaign in the first few years of his reign. There's a massive wall at Karnak Temple of Akhenaten going on campaign. So there's no question that there was no crisis. There's no crisis at that would have precipitated Atenism. Okay, what seemed to have been the circumstances for the development of Atenism was that Akhenaten wanted to make changes to the existing religion, like his father did. Amun-her-kepešef III was a reformer. He was a religious reformer. But Amun-her-kepešef III did it in a very particular way. He said to the priests at Karnak, "Hey, I want to make this change to the temples, and I'll give you a lot of money. I'll give you a lot of money if you let me make this change." And priests go, "Oh, fantastic. Go for it. Yeah, it's not something we'll die on a hill for. We'll take the money." Akhenaten thought that he should just be able to make the change because he's king. So he got a lot of passive-aggressive resistance from the priests. You see, while the king was the head of every cult of Egypt, he was high priest at the ascent of the other priests. So he could have his will blocked by priests who wouldn't follow it, put up these passive-aggressive roadblocks. And this was a constant source of irritation for Akhenaten. He couldn't get his reforms done because he hadn't greased the right palms. He thought they should just do it because he was king, not because, like his father, he shelled out a lot of cash. So he moved his cult to Amarna to get away from the influence of those meddling Karnak priests.
All right, and the last question, but not shortest. Yeah, we have a good scholar, Gary Ransburg, and his theory is that Pharaoh of Exodus is Ramses III. So he says, quote, the entire biblical narrative, including the Exodus and the wandering, spans only 4 to 6 generations. This implies that the entire narrative from Exodus entry to Exodus and wandering occurred with a century or so, a century and a half at the most. Both Ramses II and Merneptah pharaohs were quite powerful, and Egypt was stable during this period, making it difficult to imagine the Exodus occurring with either of these kings on the throne. What is your opinion, Dr. Falk?
Oh boy. Well, we've already been over that.
Yes.
Merneptah is not as powerful as we think. Okay. He definitely was not. He was not his father as far as his ability to maintain control. Egypt was not as stable during the time of Merneptah as it was during the time of Ramses II. There's no question about that. So now I think that the problem, his idea that the whole, and it's from from their beginnings in Egypt all the way to the conquest, was 4 to 6 generations. So that covers, I mean, the wandering itself is 2 generations if you figure it out by 25 years. So you're looking at roughly 22 generations, 1.5. Okay. So you got a generation just from the wandering, and probably 2. So that's going to be an issue, especially when you start looking at stuff like Exodus 6:24, where it talks about the sons or the grandsons of Korah being the heads of the clans of the Korahites. Now, this is a problem because Korah was the 2nd generation born in Egypt. Okay, he's 2nd generation. And each of the heads of the clans infers that there's another 4 generations that have already been born. So you have 6 generations just in Egypt. Okay. So you add that on to the wandering, you're at least to 7 or 8 generations. His math doesn't make sense here. His math doesn't make sense. And he does mention in some of his papers that the Israelites were exaggerating time. Like, for example, when he talks about the ages of Amram being 136 years, he's basically saying the Israelites are exaggerating that 136. So he says that the Israelites exaggerate time. But I think what's going on there is genealogical simplification. Okay, because there's a problem here with, if we take, for example, that there's 70 people that come into Egypt, the 70 sons of Jacob. You know, those are your progenitors, you know, that were born outside of Egypt for the most part. 70 people, 4 generations doesn't get you a very big number. Okay. Even at, say, maximum fertility. Okay. Even at maximum fertility, that's not a large number. Not large enough that you would be really, really concerned with basically the men rising up and joining your enemies in war. I mean, you're talking even at like maximum fertility, and we know from the CIA intelligence book that you're talking here about how many is it per children here? Let's see, 6.76 children per woman. Okay, that's the maximum human fertility rate for any nation, and that's for the nation of Niger. And that's what the benefits of modern medicine and all that. Okay, and that's according to the CIA fact book, World Fact Book. So if you're talking that kind of fertility rate, and that's a maximum fertility rate, 4 generations is only about 18,000. That's assuming the maximum fertility rate for all women. So it can't just be 4 generations. It has to be longer than that. Also, the other issue too is if these Israelites are coming in 150 years before the conquest, which the Exodus, which he puts at, I think 1190 or something like that, or was it? You had 1175.
Yeah, 1175 about. I believe.
Okay. So you add 150 years to that, you're talking around 1340. That's the Amarna period. There's no evidence of any sort of Exodus entry in at that time. It doesn't make a lot of sense. You already have an established people at Avaris at this time. So how does this even work? So, there's issues there. I've got some real issues with some of his things here, like even that whole idea that that the kings of Nepta and Ramses were so powerful that they could stop an Exodus. Well, in the case of Ramses II, and in the case of the biblical story, the Exodus wasn't stopped. It was the Israelites were expelled. So you still need a powerful king to do an expulsion. You don't have a weak king do an expulsion. Strong kings do expulsions. Weak kings just sit there and do nothing. Weak kings go, yeah, could you please leave? Please, please. Strong kings go, there's the door, use it. And I even have some of his problems with some of his rationalizations on the other page. You didn't read that yet, but
yes, we can go on by one.
Yeah, let's go on. Let's continue.
Yeah, he gives facts that fits that period for his Exodus theory. The tracking down of 2 slaves in the desert who escaped via Migdol. That's evidence for his case. Do you agree, maybe?
I think that text is irrelevant because it doesn't fit with his time either. I don't think this really helps his case in any way because, again, it's sort of apples and oranges. The Exodus is not about a slave escape. It's about a slave expulsion. So under those circumstances where slaves are getting basically thrown out, you've got a completely different situation than what a tracked slave would be.
Yes. Next evidence, he mentioned Philistines because it's mentioned also in Bible, and in history we see first example in that specific year when he suggests Exodus happen.
Yeah. Oh boy. It's wrong because it's not the first example. Okay. The earliest example we have of a Sea People's tribe. Now, when we talk about the Philistines, um, the Sea People's invasion is the first time we hear the word paliset. Okay. But the Sea Peoples is made up of many tribes of Sea People, not just one. And in the invasion of the 8th year of Ramses III, that's where you have a coalition of Sea People tribes trying to who are already settled in Canaan. We forget that. These are people who are already settled in Canaan. These are Sea People's tribes that have already settled on the coastal plain. And they're now getting together, and now they're doing an invasion of Egypt. And they're attacking those Ketem fortresses on the Sinai, on the north coast of the Sinai. Okay. So this is not the first mention of the Sea Peoples, not by a long shot. They are mentioned in the battles of Kadesh. Ramses II, already in his 5th regnal year, mentions several tribes of Sea Peoples. He mentions the Luca. He mentions the Dardania, and he also mentions the Sheridan. Okay, those are tribes of Sea Peoples, and they're already on the coastal plain when Ramses II marches up to Kadesh. So they're already there in the early 13th century. The earliest mention we actually have of a Sea People's tribe is actually in one of the Amarna letters, El Amarna 38, which talks about the Luca. So there's a lot of reasons here. I mean, it's just not restricted to Ramses III. We see this that already long before Ramses III, the Sea Peoples are already on the coastal plain of Canaan. They're already established there, and basically they're established there 50 years before the Israelites try to enter into the Judean foothills through the Arnon and Heshbon.
When Bible mentions that battle was between Egyptians and Philistines in the time of the Exodus, does it fit in 1265-ish years BC?
The Bible doesn't mention that there was a battle between the Egyptians and the Sea Peoples. It doesn't mention that. That's not in the Bible.
Oh, okay.
Not in the Bible at all. Okay. We do have one mention in, say, the book of Exodus about the road to the land of the Philistines. So there are references to Philistines in the Pentateuch. Okay. Some of those are retrojective references, like we find in the book of Genesis, but in, say, the book of Exodus, that's a catch bucket reference to the Sea Peoples. And as I said, they're already on the coastal plain in 1288. They're already there. They're already there by the time of the Battle of Kadesh. So the fact that the Bible does mention them all, the book of Exodus mentions them already, is just an acknowledgement of the fact that they're already there.
Okay, but text says if the people see war, they may have a change of heart and go back to Egypt.
Yes, that's not a battle. It's a little different, isn't it?
So what that text?
Okay, what that text is saying, that road, the road to the land of the Philistines, is named by the Egyptians the Road of Horse. It was a road of military forts that lined the north of the Sinai, protecting the road between Egypt and Canaan. And it began at Pi-Ramzes and technically Charu, and ended at Gaza. So this is what would have happened if the Israelites had taken that road. If they had taken that road, they would have encountered battle after battle, as they would have encountered each fortress. So they would have encountered a battle at every fortress along the way. And then they would have encountered war as soon as they entered the coastal plain, because it's already occupied by the sea peoples. So that's what the text means here when it says that if they take the road to the land of the Philistines, they may encounter war, lose heart, and want to go back.
Okay, that helps. And last, and we finish after that, 4-room houses at Medinet Habu. I believe Manfred Bittak says that those houses belongs to Israelites, maybe. So is that evidence?
It's evidence that there were Semites still living in Egypt after the Exodus, sure. We also have 4-room houses at Avaris before.
Mm-hmm.
We have 4-room houses at Avaris happening as early as the Hyksos period.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not something that's restricted to Medina Habu in any way. In fact, the one that we find at Medina Habu is kind of a one-off. We don't find 4-room houses much after the abandonment at Avaris. They were common before. They were common before at Avaris. There was the typical housing pattern at Avaris. But after Avaris, the abandonment of Avaris in the mid-dynasty, 19th dynasty, you didn't get very many. So the one at Medina Habu is very unusual in that respect. It's a later 4-room house. So it does show that there were some Semitic Asiatics that were still in Egypt at the time. But they just sort of, the vast majority of those homes ceased to be built after. We basically see them more or less stop mid-dynasty 19, but we see them resume again in Canaan in the early 12th dynasty, or sorry, 12th century, the early 12th century. So that's when we see them resume again. So they go from being built at Avaris en masse to then being built in Canaan en masse. And there seems to be a continuity there that the people were building these homes in Avaris before. There's that one example at Medina Habu. And then they start building them again around, say, the 1180s, 1150s, as new Israelite settlements are established in Canaan.
Okay, and I found this quote. Herschel Shanks says that besides the Medinet Habu, one more 4-room house outside Israel has been found at Tal al-Umairi, I don't know how to pronounce, in Jordan by leading Canadian archaeologist Larry Hare. So that's not specifically for Israelites.
No, probably not.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Falk, that's all. And can you give us some conclusion and send a message to people or anything else? Can you say something?
I think there's plenty of evidence for the Exodus. I think it's good evidence. I think a lot of, say, the objections tend to sort of add cognitive load. So you're putting assumptions upon assumptions upon assumptions to build an objection against it. As we've shown here, there's lots of evidence, there's lots of data, and it is consistent with the biblical narrative.
Okay, Dr. Falk, it has been an absolute pleasure having you once again on our show. Your insights are invaluable, and our audience always enjoy your teachings. So to our viewers, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, NT Podcast, and also follow Dr. Falk's channel, Ancient Egypt and the Bible, for more fascinating content. Until next time, goodbye.